So cute. Hello and welcome everyone to this episode of the Human-Centered AI Vodcast. This is Vanessa Parli, and I'm Wang. Vanessa is the Director of Research at Stanford's Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence Institute. I'm an Associate Professor in Music by Courtesy Computer Science, and I'm a Senior Fellow and a Faculty Associate Director of HAI. And we always begin our vodcast with what we call the HAI Vodcast preamble to kind of set the stage a little bit. And so I'll just read that right now. What do we really want from artificial intelligence? We live in a time when advancements in AI technology is shaping our world while critically outpacing our understanding of this technology in various humanistic contexts: cultural, social, ethical, historical, aesthetic. But also, look, we are Stanford, one of the most powerful academic institutions located in the heart of Silicon Valley, and yet it is all too easy to be in a profound bubble. Much of the world knows and cares about AI far less or far differently than we might assume. It's also all too easy to be sure of ourselves as the technology creators while remaining out of touch with the rest of the world. We tell ourselves that more technology often is the solution. For those who are engineers, technology is what we know, and we're eager to apply our craft. Unfortunately, it's all too easy to do so with the lack of understanding of the social, cultural, historical contexts, while not even considering the possibility that often problems in our world are seldom lack of technology problems, but entrenched human problems. And I would add that technology itself is perhaps one of those challenges that we are confronting. But of course, we keep moving fast because that is good for business. Even when we design tech for social good, we too often just end up making something slightly more convenient, because slightly more convenient fits the prevailing economic narrative. This is the bubble, the technology cave we might not know we are living in. So I think it's the goal of this vodcast to highlight this need to interrogate ourselves better, to better understand how we as individuals and as communities would want to live with AI technology, and through our creations, how we would want to live with one another. We would like to seek distinction between intelligence and this thing we might call wisdom. Working definition, intelligence might be defined as having the tools and the means to achieve what you desire, whereas wisdom could be defined as having the capacity to critically assess those desires in the first place, and to assess the means and the tools you would have to achieve those desires. So we ask again, what do we really want from it all? And I would also add, perhaps above all, what does it mean to do AI with some, heart and compassion? What does that even look like? So this particular episode, which is entitled, What Do We Really Want from AI in the Humanities? Well, this is our episode 5, but this is also the first episode we're doing outside of the Gates building, the computer science building. And this is kind of an experiment we're doing here today to actually have this at the Stanford Humanities Center. We're very grateful for the SHC for having us, but also this is an intentional kind of an experiment on our part to try to bring different communities together and to begin, more conversations.
So welcome again, everybody, to the first episode of the HAI Vodcast of this academic year. For those of you who are new, the Vodcast is like a hybrid podcast seminar video series that we piloted last year. And each episode we bring on, we focus on a particular topic and bring 2 people who can as our guest to speak on that topic. So as Ga mentioned today, we're focusing on AI and the humanities, and we will be introducing our guests in a short while. And again, as I mentioned, this is our first time at the Stanford Humanities Center. Generally, we do host this at the Gates Computer Science Building. So it's really an effort to kind of bring kind of the humanities and the technologists together in a new way. I guess to kick off, I thought I would ask you to talk about how are you feeling about the current state of how these two groups are interacting?
Oh boy. Well, I'm going to kind of transfer that question to every one of you in the room and also joining us online. I want to put these words up: artificial intelligence, the humanities. How do you feel about where we are? And this is a general question, and it's an how do you feel question, so there's no wrong answer, but I think it's a good question. How y'all feeling about the state of things? And in fact, before I go further, maybe want to take a quick poll just in the room. How many people would consider yourself working on the AI side of things? By the way, you can raise your hand more than once, of course. So how many people are working on AI, tech, products, etc.? How many people here would identify as like a humanist? Okay, it's a good mix. I can tell how many people raise your hand multiple times. I kind of do both. And Vanessa, did you raise your hand?
I didn't raise my hand. I don't know what I am.
You're an engineer. Well, you're an engineer by training, but you're also in the director of research of human-centered AI. So
yes, yeah. So my background is engineering. I lead the research programs at HAI, and I often say, I think I mentioned it in one of our previous episodes, that up until I was at HAI, I did not pay much attention to kind of like the non-engineering disciplines. And what I have actually found most interesting in my role is talking to the philosophers and the humanists and all of the people who are not engineers and think so differently than like how I was trained to think. So that's been really fun. And yeah, I guess like to this question about this intersection, because of my role, I do where we lead a bunch of grant programs. So, and the goal of those grant programs is to bring these various all around campus disciplines together. So I do get to see like a lot of really exciting proposal where the humanists are working with the technologists, with the lawyers, with the medicine doctors. And so I guess from my perspective, I feel like there is a lot going on.
And it's encouraging to hear that, right? So we at HAI actually are seeing more and more kind of humanists actually submitting proposals for kind of various research projects using AI tools and techniques. I guess how I would feel is kind of almost like the flip side of that coin, and it has a lot to do with kind of AI education here at Stanford, but also just worldwide, but also just the way the world regards kind of how we ought to progress in AI. And I guess if you're asking how I feel, I feel like, well, there's, with some exceptions, I feel like there's a huge disconnect, right? I mean, I'm an engineer by training, and I work with AI, and I'm a computer music guy, researcher. So I build actually wacky musical instruments with computers that nobody asked for, that solves no problems that seem to exist. At the same time, I think in my grad school application, I wrote that I want to go to grad school in computer science to build the world's most badass algorithmic composition engine. I did not do that in grad school. I ended up building a programming language for music because I couldn't answer the question, what's the point, right? So in a way, my kind of crisis with AI, crisis of faith with AI, has been like 20 years in counting. But the disconnect that I feel like today, is something that I think I want to ask. This is why I think we're here. Is that I don't see as many. Maybe things are changing, but in the courses I'm teaching, in the students, in the projects, and in colleagues on various schools at Stanford, I don't see AI like in the engineering sense and AI in the humanities sense kind of coming together almost ever. And more to the point, I feel like the disconnect is that AI, seems to be largely taught without also teaching kind of the humanistic tools. And by that, I mean, well, it's one thing to say, okay, you're trying to build something with AI. How could this go wrong? right? There's a whole like, let's make sure that this doesn't do any harm. And certainly bias has been something that's very well documented, even though this still remains a huge problem. However, I think a humanist might ask that question, but also a humanist would also ask a kind of question that's more like, what if the thing you're trying to build AI actually worked as intended? And it's out there in the world, and a lot of people are using it. And that's changed the way that we live our lives, that we communicate with one another, that we learn, that we teach, that we work, that we express ourselves. What if the thing we're building actually worked? How do I know that how do I figure out, not know, how do I think through whether that's like a good thing? And what does good even look like, right? So in a way, I would say for me, the disconnect is that I don't know if we're giving our students or even ourselves as AI kind of researchers, kind of these humanistic aesthetic tools. So I'm going to just, so this is kind of, I've much more to say on this, but I think the idea that I want to highlight today is I think there's two sides. It's kind of what AI does, what humanists can learn from AI in AI research and tools that we can use, but also I think AI, particularly AI education and perhaps AI anything, kind of needs the humanities, like critically needs the humanities. One quick example, I'm bringing back this thing called the pie-shaped person. If you've been in a previous episode of the podcast, you might remember that. And this idea is something that we run in higher ed. So we asked the question, for like someone, an engineer, maybe here at Stanford, what kind of an engineer do we want to educate? What we said we don't want is like an I-shaped person. That's like the letter I, very narrowly, just one thing. You're just in your discipline. Then we're like, maybe we should educate T-shaped people, right? You got some depth, you also have some breadth. So in my book, Artful Design, I kind of flesh out this idea of a pie-shaped person, right? And like the letter and the number pi, the idea is that on one leg, there's disciplinary expertise. For me, that was computer science. On the other leg is something we might call domain expertise. For me, that was music, but for someone else, it could be public health. But there's one more stroke in this pie. And this is the thing on top, which I would call the aesthetic lens, the philosophical, artistic, moral lens that gives broader meaning and context in bridging these two legs. And I think the idea with something like the pie-shaped person is that what if this is how we educated ourselves? And if we have a discipline that we're applying to a domain, I think in a way, it's the aesthetic lens that really gives us the broader and critical tools to actually size up the best we can what we're actually doing. And in a way, I think to me, Vanessa, I think this is why I think engineering, the humanities, the arts, the social sciences, these are things that, well, these are not even things that to be added back together. These are things that probably should never be taken apart. And so that's kind of my long and windy kind of setup for kind of why I'm here today with you.
Yes. So with that, I'm going to invite our two guests to the stage. So first we have Professor Mark Algie Hewitt. He is an associate professor of English and digital humanities. He's the director of the Stanford Literary Lab, and research combines literary criticism with digital and quantitative analysis for literature and other textual corpora. So Mark, feel free to choose whichever chair you would prefer. And then next we have Chris Manning. So Professor Chris Manning is a professor of machine learning in the Department of Linguistics and Computer Science. He is director of the Stanford Artificial Intelligence Laboratory, or SAIL, and associate director of the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence. His research goal is to create computers that can intelligently process and understand and generate human languages. So welcome both of you to the stage. And then for those of you who have been with us before, you know that we like to kick things off with our guests with a segment we call Origin Stories. So we have gathered some baby pictures of Chris and Mark. And I want to invite you both to share a little bit, so maybe like 3 minutes. I know the stories can get long, about like what brought you where you are today. Were there things that happened in your life that kind of changed your trajectory, etc.? So maybe we'll start with Chris since you're closer.
Okay, so I was born in Queensland, Australia, on a sugar plantation. And so I guess you can see very little of the house here, but this was sort of a company house on a sugar plantation. And yeah, I won't dwell on too many tales of that. But later on, I mean, while I was in high school, I was certainly a kid that was, interested in math, and it was around that time that the early PCs started to turn up. This was, before the era of either Mac or Windows PCs, but there started to be TRS-80s, Commodores, Apple IIs, all of those early things, and I was certainly interested in those. But I was also interested in other things, and I mean, sort of how my life took its path was actually in an English classroom, because one of my high school teachers there, I'm actually not sure how much of a background she had as a linguist, but she'd certainly studied, at least in English, Old English and similar things. And she had a book on her shelf that was an intro to linguistics. And I was looking at that one day, and one of the things that I saw in that was the International Phonetic Alphabet. And as a high school student, having spent the requisite number of years learning all the weird ways that different English words are spelled, the idea that you could just have a system of sounds and write down the sounds of any language, and in a way that anyone could see how to pronounce things, that seemed to me a revolutionary idea. So actually, in my very first semester as an undergrad, I enrolled in a linguistics class, as well as in a computer science and math class. Yeah, I should probably keep this short, but that was sort of my direction. I was interested in computer science and linguistics. And, at that time in the 80s in Australia, there was really no way that you could combine those two things together, because there's just no computational linguistics in Australia. And so then I ended up in the US, actually right here, for my PhD. And that's where I started to do computational linguistics, or natural language processing, as computer scientists more commonly call it, since they mainly deal with unnatural languages. And so that's essentially been the interest that's stayed with me ever after. And so, these days, I'm the director of the Stanford AI Lab, which is in the computer science department, and I have a joint position with computer science. But, something I often say to computer science department people, like students, is I'm not really an engineer, right? Where I went to undergrad, they actually didn't have an engineering school. I did a Bachelor of Arts, my PhD's in linguistics. So I'm sort of a very techie person in one sense, but in another sense, I'm not an engineer.
Yeah, yeah. But your office is in the computer science building, and yeah, I think of you as a both person. So. Mark, go ahead.
Yeah, well, first and foremost, thank you so much for inviting me to take part in this conversation. It's a real treat to be able to sit down and have a chance to reflect with such an interesting interlocutor and group of people on all of the issues that you both raised around AI and the humanities. So much like Chris, I'm not a U.S. citizen. Actually, I'm not a U.S. citizen now. I was going to say by birth. I'm from Canada, from the East Coast, from a fairly small town in Nova Scotia. And much like Chris, I had an early introduction to all things computational when I was about 5 years old. My parents bought me a Commodore 64, then state of the art, and about 5 games that I subsequently played out over the course of 2 years. And because I was living in such a small town, it's not like we had a local Radio Shack where I could go buy new games for it. So I was forced to learn BASIC in order to start programming my own amusements on the computer. So that birthed in me, I think, a long-term love of just computation in general, but also the way that we can use computers to create things. And this balance between computation and the more creative arts very much defined, I think, a lot of my education. I was a very lost undergraduate. I actually started in physics and lasted for about 2 weeks before moving completely 180 degrees to a music degree, which I did most of before realizing I was never going to make it as a performer and I didn't want to teach it. But along the way, I cultivated these two interests. I've always been really interested in books, in the stories that we tell ourselves, how narratives are constructed, the work that writing does in the world. And so I wound up getting degrees in both computer science and English, and came to a crossroads at the end of my undergraduate degree where I had to decide whether or not I wanted to go on to a graduate degree in computer science and build things, which is what I thought at the time one did with a graduate degree in computer science, or whether I wanted to keep studying language and the arts. And I chose the latter and sort of put the computer science behind me. But it turns out that the kind of questions that I wanted to ask about language and about literature, again, why we tell the stories that we do, how are narratives constructed both locally, but also at very large scales? What are the commonalities that link the stories we tell across time, across cultures, across different kinds of writing? These are really big questions. And literary studies has been trying to get at them for a number of years, but our tools have never been quite calibrated to ask those kinds of questions. And so midway through my PhD, after proposing a completely unworkable project where I think I suggested I was going to sit and read about a third of all of the books written in the 18th century, I realized that the thing I actually wanted to do was possible with the techniques that I had learned from my early natural language processing classes during my undergraduate computer science degree. And so I tried it out, and it kind of worked. I found some things I wasn't expecting. It really transformed my ability to understand the cultural objects I was interested in investigating. And so one thing led to another. A graduate degree led to a visiting assistant professorship and then a postdoc. And at each step, I sort of became a little bit more and more immersed in this sort of cross world between computation and literary studies. And so when the opportunity to come to Stanford arose and to take over the Stanford Literary Lab, which is a pioneering institution for studying literature through the lens of computational methods, I took it, and the rest is history. And so now with the Literary Lab, we run a number of different projects. Being interdisciplinary has given me, and I think a lot of people that I work with, the ability to cross all sorts of lines that we find drawn in the academic world, both methodologically, but also subject-wise. So we run projects on the literature, for example, of science fiction and looking at how worlds are built, but also on climate fiction, seeing how facts are embedded within climate narratives, on very traditional things like Gothic literature of the 19th century, but also less traditional things. We've partnered with, for example, scholars from the law school, looking at how naming and shaming works to help correct bribery in countries around the world. So that's a broad introduction to the things I'm interested in, but it's all really about this kind of multi-modality, how these two things can come together.
That's great. Yeah, so I guess for questions, I'll start with you, Mark. You talked about your work and how you've been using these tools to study various concepts and kind of how they change and morph over time. The new kind of generation of AI technologies, large language models, ingest a ton of this data. How are you seeing this fitting into kind of that narrative of your work?
It's a complicated question. When people have asked me about this, like sort of naively, I'll point out that, in the lab, we've been building, medium and small language models for like a decade now. So like we're like AI hipsters. We were doing like language models before they were cool. And they've always been part of how we understand language working, from like the very early sort of machine learning models up through like word embeddings. I will say that to me, and I was really caught by the question that you posed to label this this event. What do we want from AI and the humanities? Because I kind of factored it, right? Like, what do we want from AI? What do we want from the humanities? And those are really two different questions that I think have some relationship to each other. But to me, it really highlights the way that I think there's some reflection there. And what I mean is this. In the work that I do and in the work that I lead and collaborate on at the literary lab, AI has the potential of becoming another tool in our toolbox to be able to ask the kinds of questions that we want to ask about literature, about writing, about text. And a not straightforward one, and one that introduces some interesting problems that I'd be happy to talk more about. And I think problems having to do with how we interact with it and where we position it. But at the same time, I think there's an obverse to that as well, which is, and this is a mostly untapped so far area of research, but it has to do with what AI says about how we study and think about language, and how we study and think particularly about language used to craft narrative and used to tell stories. Because so much of my field has focused, and when I say my field, I mean English literature, has focused on the work that language does. It predicates a lot of the conclusions that it draws from literary theory on this idea that kind of language is all you need, right? We make meaning out of language, unlike science, in which you might run an experiment, collect a bunch of data, collect numbers, run some math on those numbers, make some charts, and then draw conclusions from that. And you can say the same thing about social science. In the humanities, most of the products of our research come from a kind of narrativization. If you sit down and read a English literature paper, but if you read a history paper, if you read a philosophy paper, if you read a classics paper, right, the actual form of knowledge production is narrative, right? We tell a story with language, and we use language to produce knowledge. And now we have this thing, this large language model that is designed to produce language. And we haven't really asked the question, okay, so it produces language. Maybe it produces meaning, but does it produce knowledge? It looks like the kind of work that we do, or it can look like the kind of work we can do. But does that mean that we can use the tools of literature? Can we use the tools of literary theory or historical analysis or the methodologies of classics philosophy to interrogate the products of AI or of large language models? And so there's this obverse relationship, I think, that we have a real potential if we want to take advantage of it, and that we can put pressure, I think, on the humanities using large language models in the same way that I think we can put pressure, and we should put pressure in the way that you started off by talking about, on AI broadly conceived or large language models using the humanities. So I think it can very much be both sides.
Yeah. So Chris, you're an AI hipster as well, and have studied NLP for a very long time. So one, yeah, any reactions to what Mark said? Like I noted, kind of like, is language all you need? But then also, yeah, has these foundation models kind of shifted our understanding of like language and meaning?
I'm not sure that large language models have really shifted yet our notions of language and meaning. I think, though, that they do provide some new realities, which mean that there are very interesting things to think about and explore in that domain. And by that I mean, there's now, lots of ill-informed discussion that you could read on social media or from random computer science people talking about, whether, the utterance, what large language models produce has meaning, whether these large language models understand things, whether they have knowledge, and some people then want to go on to debate from there whether there will be the rise of consciousness from large language models. And I think up until now, the rise of large language models hasn't really added anything to our understanding of those issues, but I feel like it should. And that's because these are issues and concepts that have been talked about, though also quite often presupposed, for millennia in the humanities. And here we have this new, very different thing with very different properties, but some glimmerings of meaning and understanding. So, and some glimmerings, some would say, of sentience or consciousness. So surely having that different thing should give us some more insight, some more grist for humanistic thinking as to how we should think about these different concepts. And so if I want to put out a challenge for the people who are humanists in the room, I mean, like, there are a couple of people I know who have started considering some of those issues, but extremely, extremely few. I think it would actually be good if more people with a humanistic background were starting to embrace this question of, given this reality of large language models and other kinds of visual language models and foundation models that are coming along, what are they telling us about humanity? What are they telling us about intelligence and knowledge? I think there's a lot to think about there. And in general, like that, I think, I think there's sort of more interesting stuff to engage with that is raised by large language models. And the engagement so far has been scant. Now, I sort of confessed early on that I'm kind of only a sort of a pseudo humanist, right? My primary department is in linguistics here, which officially counts as part of the humanities, but linguistics is sort of fairly mixed up as to whether it's humanities, social sciences, or just techie people like me anyway. So, I think, about the level I can rise to is when my computer science colleagues are sometimes condemnatory of the humanities, I can at least point out to them enough the value of the humanities that it does sort of hit them and they're forced to stop and think and feel they don't have an answer to all the questions of life. So having with that self-deprecating intro, if I sort of dangerously proceed into post-structuralism, which my knowledge is about, that deep, I think, so post-structuralist thinking wasn't something I grew up on. I was very much on the cognitive science side where that sort of stuff was over somewhere else. But, there's an interesting way in which the rise of these large language models sort of fits into certain kinds of post-structuralist thinking in a kind of a weird way that not only their inventors never intended, but their inventors don't really understand, right? So that the kind of thinking about texts of someone like Foucault, or I think it was Roland Barthes, who talked about the death of the author, right? That's essentially what we've created with these large language models. We've got these devices where you've slurped in an unbelievable amount of human writing, and they're producing pieces of text which sometimes seem to show wisdom, but they're not authored by anybody. They don't know who they're drawing from in producing this stuff. At most, they kind of have some kind of association that they realized, some author name was somewhere near the piece of text that's influencing some statistic. And that sort of seems kind of interesting, and as if there could be more thought about these issues.
Super interesting. So I'll throw out just a kind of a quick reaction, but also then have questions following up to that as well. I think in a way, like, I think at the intersection of, say, like our current generation of of AI, right? LLMs, powered by foundation models, transformer, and really kind of, it seems like, well, one of the things that the both of you are saying is that, the issues that come up, there are questions of meaning. Within meaning, I would also say there's it seems to be a difference between, I'm not a linguist, so forgive me if I using the wrong terminology, but I think of semantic meaning as something that is attached in a way to language, or at least is very closely associated, and that networks of, say, linguistic forms give rise to different levels of meaning, but also that our current generation of machines is able to, well, learn semantic meaning. And I'm using those words kind of vaguely, but I would say it seems like, for example, an LLM seems to be taking a word at any term and able to, with the context around it, able to find ever more nuanced kind of semantic meaning, right, within this high dimensional latent space. And that's what's actually giving us kind of this generation, surprisingly, I would say, competent sometimes large language models. And yet, Mark, you talked about kind of the issues of, and there's an other side of meaning, which is not necessarily semantic meaning, but kind of, I would say, more humanistic meaning. It's the meaning that we draw, right? I mean, if there's an image of a cat with spilled milk in a kitchen, right? I think an AI is able basically there's semantic meaning that the AI can say there's a cat spilled milk on AI. Humanistic meaning, I think, seems to be, I don't know what the word is, different. I look at that picture and the first thing I think of is uh-oh, ruh-roh. And I think I would call that the beginning of almost an aesthetic reaction. And this then goes to this idea of is there a difference between semantic meaning and other forms of meaning as we now understand, kind of as LLMs helping us to understand? Secondly, this idea that you mentioned, knowledge, right? Which is something that I think the humanities may have tools to help us think through this, because with humanistic tools, I don't think our current generation AI knows, right? It kind of depends on your definition of what knowledge is. And some might say if you define knowledge as needing, is it basically some kind of evidence belief, right? Then that belief implies a believer, and almost like a subjective, like a entity actually who's holding that belief. And I don't think we have no notions of that, because right now what we have are incredibly sophisticated language models. So I'm sorry for this. So this is my kind of quick reaction to what I'm wondering if you had you kind of any. I'm sure you have many thoughts on this, the two of you. I will tack on my questions at the end of this, so you can feel free to parlay this into the questions about the future, maybe the near future, maybe I don't know about the distant future. Is that back to this question of kind of AI in the humanities, right? How, given what we're talking about right now, are there things that you would wish to see? What are your hopes, dreams, fears, things that you would, want to shift a bit or nudge a bit? So I'm going to lob all of that over back to the two of you, if I may.
Should have given you notebooks to note down.
Yeah,
Oh.
you can choose to answer any of that or none of that, and I just wanted to.
Yeah, well, I can try. Chris, I was really interested to hear you take it to a post-structural place, because the reactions to large language models and sort of the explosion of what the public interest in AI over the last 2 years since ChatGPT first made itself known on the scene. I mean, there's been a lot of fear, been a lot of caution, a lot of warning about what we're doing to it and what it's going to do to us, both as humans, but also very specifically in a departmental or educational context. But every once in a while, I'll come across a reaction from someone, mostly working in literary study, who will suddenly realize that what AI has ushered in is this kind of Wittgensteinian fever dream, right? And Wittgenstein says that to create meaning, you don't need a dictionary. right? There's no fundamental meaning to any word. Rather, it's all a contextual language game. If you know the rules and you can put together words that belong together because they appear in the same contexts, then you can effectively communicate with other people. I'm being very broad about that, but that's the core idea. And when you actually like crack open the hood of a large language model, that's kind of what it does, right? Like it turns out that these really sophisticated next word prediction algorithms are able to do this contextualized work and very broadly contextualized, both what word belongs in the sentence, but also what word belongs in the sentence that is also attached to other sentences around it, but it's still all context, right? And it's a kind of this realization that like this post-structural notion of language as these infinite signifying chains actually does lie somewhere at the heart of what we might consider to be meaning. But I think, and this goes to your question about the future, where I am disheartened to a certain degree, is that I think there's some like revolutionary potential there that everything we're doing with AI is working against in like really boring ways. And I think a lot of this has to do with the pressures of the business world and the fact that the AI hype bubble at the moment is causing adoption in certain ways. But when we talk about AI, and I want to differentiate between what I'm going to call AI, which is the whole complex of things, and like the large language models that live at the heart of it. What we're doing is we're confusing the underlying operation, which is the ability of these language models to say, for example, go to a corpus of scientific articles and parse them all and pull out really interesting similarities. And the way that we interact with them, which is through these chat-based natural languages interfaces. And because the engine for both of those tends to operate very similarly in these AI models, I think we're confusing those two things, right? Like ChatGPT or GPT-01 gives me the ability to use natural language to interact with this alterity. But then it also is the thing that underlies that engine's ability to go off and do the thing that I've asked it to do. And for me, my optimistic vision of the future is that we separate those things, right? Like in some ways, natural language is the least interesting way to interact with large language models because they think about, they treat, they understand, and I'm using those, somewhat controversial words very deliberately, but insofar as we can imagine them thinking about understanding or treating text, they do it radically differently than we do as humans. And by grafting on this kind of natural language interface to them, what we're doing is we're saying, all right, we want you to take this kind of like radically different way of dealing with text and make it compatible with our humanistic way of understanding text. And that's an interesting gesture, which I think needs to be unpacked. But I think that if we can explore ways of getting around that, of interacting with it outside of natural language, and I'm not exactly sure what this looks like, I think we can get to some really interesting uses and possibilities of the underlying technology that we're papering over, that this kind of incremental, we want it to be friendly and approachable, and we want it to be vaguely skeuomorphic, so it just feels like you're having a conversation, with your friend who's answering questions because they know a lot more than you. Like that takes away, I think, a lot of the potential of the underlying technology in a way that kind of disappoints me.
Chris, do you have, I saw some reaction, go ahead.
Yeah, lots of thoughts from every direction. Let me first off go back to meaning. So at least from what I gathered from what Mark said, I think we broadly actually agree on meaning. But let me just sort of unpack a little bit more of that space, right? So the dominant approach that's used in linguistics, but also in programming languages for that matter, for thinking about and in philosophy, of thinking about meaning, is that meaning is a mapping from a form, a linguistic form, to something else that is the meaning of that form, right? And so, when you do it at Stanford or anywhere else, you do, the sort of semantics class where you're taught formal semantics, and that's what you're taught. Meaning mapping from your understanding is mapping from form to meaning, and the meaning is normally represented as a formal logical representation, but sometimes people have done things with other kinds of formal probabilistic representation. And some people take that as completely axiomatic. And so in the on the dangers of stochastic parrots paper, or an earlier work of Bender and Kohler, it takes what's actually this incredibly conservative philosophical position that there is no meaning unless you have a mapping from a form to a semantic formalism. Therefore, large language models have absolutely no meaning. They're just, stochastically producing sequences of words. I think that is completely wrong. I think it is, some things are sort of as much intuitive or emotional as reasoned. But, my gut feeling is, well, it's just obvious when you play with large language models that they understand the meaning of words and text, not 100%, but to a pretty large degree. And I think the way to think about that is in line with the kind of directions that Mark was talking about, a later Wittgensteinian position of notions of meaning, where meanings can arrive by understanding in context, use theories of meaning, knowing when it's appropriate to use a piece of language relative to the world or prior linguistic context that comes before it, understanding the associations of words. Large language models are actually just enormously good association machines done at an enormous scale. And I think, coming back to something Gur mentioned when he was wanting to distinguish between, I forget the words you use, linguistic meaning and what it means to me, or humanistic meaning, you might have called it. I mean, I think something to actually realize is these large language models are incredibly good at humanistic meaning, actually, because of the way they've absorbed so much of the output of humanity. So it's not just that a large language model, knows what a saxophone is or something like that. They're incredibly aware of things, right? So if you give to one of the large language models of, okay, here's a scenario, here's some couple, one of the couple said this and the other person then said that, which was somehow uncaring, and then you say, dear large language model, how do you think that made the first person feel? They can answer those kind of questions really well and give very empathetic seeming answers. Now, so that's has humanistic meaning, you might say. The question is then where you go from this, and I think also then touched on knowledge. So I guess a classic philosophical definition of knowledge is justified true belief. And well, I think you could say large language models have justifications. You can ask them the reasons that they thought that the first person in my scenario was upset, and they'll be able to say some good justifications. They have a lot of information about what's true or not. I mean, there are sort of issues with falsehoods being out there in the world that they pick up as well. But, to a fair degree, they understand the true state of the world. And the question is whether language models have beliefs. And I think intuitively, I kind of feel like language models don't have beliefs. But, that's where then this gets into very deep philosophical questions of, well, what does it mean to think that a human somehow has beliefs, but a large language model doesn't? And I'm not sure I can give a convincing answer to that, so I'll just leave that one hanging for a minute. But I mean, I think my intuitive understanding is that a large language model is an incredibly good simulacrum, that it's been built on so much of human behavior that it understands to an amazing degree how humans behave, so that if you have a scenario and ask how one of the participants felt, or you ask what are they likely to say next, its ability to predict is often extremely good, and it seems therefore as if it's empathic and has good understanding of human situations to an extent that I think fools many people. And so that's why many people then start saying, oh, this model is sentient because it can respond to these situations. I think that's wrong. I think it's a really good simulacrum. But it's then sort of a kind of a deep question of, well, exactly how and why are human beings different? Because to some extent, we're also going around the world and seeing how humans react when they are confronted with different scenarios. And I think we learn predictive behavior ourselves based on a lot of experience in the world. And so that then comes into questions of, how is our physical embodied existence, the actual feelings of pain, etc., make us different to a large language model. Oh yeah, then I was going to disagree with Mark at the end. Sorry, now I'm slipping. At the end, you were expressing disappointment with the fact that these two functions have been tied together and human language is being used as the interface to large language models. I think I just disagree with that. I think that is awesome. So let me just say the version of why it's awesome. And this is a question. This is really putting my techie hat on for a minute and about the accessibility of artificial intelligence tools. So, until ChatGPT came out, and so that was November 2022, right? Less than 2 years ago. Until that was that, and I talked to some random person further afield from the tech scene, and I said, oh, there's all this great, interesting stuff happening in artificial intelligence, and there really had been for sort of a decade, 2010 forward, and they expressed some interest in it and wondered how they could get involved. Well, the story was, well, gee, first you should learn Python, and then you're going to have to learn a machine learning package, and then you're going to do this and that, and then maybe you might be able to see how cool it is. Where since, why ChatGPT so shook the world was it gave this natural, easy on-ramp to all of humanity to artificial intelligence, because human languages have been the universal system of interface, of communication between intelligent agents. And now we had this method that our artificial intelligence could communicate using the same universal intelligent agent communication mechanism. So, now when I go and talk to people, regardless of whether I'm talking to high school students or business executives, I can simply say, look, everybody should have played around with these modern artificial intelligence systems and see what they do. Anyone can do it. Anyone who knows the basics of how to use a web browser, you just go to this LLM and you type some language in a text box and you can get it to do amazing things. And if you haven't done that by now, you're really missing out and should have.
I do want to, if I can respond quickly to that, because I think that's a really good point. And I think I overstated what I was saying, because I think you're absolutely right. Accessibility is a really key factor. I have feelings about it, because I have feelings about, using a tool that you aren't quite sure how it works, like even at the basic level. So I think there is still a call where it would be good for people to have a better understanding. But I think I wasn't saying that I want to get rid of the interface using natural language altogether. I want to decouple it from the underlying process of what happens next. So I think keeping the function of ChatGPT's interface and applying it to just about any kind of interaction we have with the computer would be actually a great thing. I really want ways of interacting with the underlying model that doesn't necessitate that. I want the option. I want to be able to get stuff out of it that's not necessarily language.
Yeah, that's valid. I'm fine with that.
Like more than just chatbot.
Yeah.
Well, as you can see, there are many different and sometimes converging and sometimes diverging kind of ways to look at all of this. And I think this is the kind of conversation I do wish we have much more of, and one that involved exactly the kinds of, I think, back and forth in dialogue that I think we have here.
Yeah.
But I think we're running up on time on this portion. We want to hear from you and your questions. In the kind of, I will call it kind of we'll close this portion of the show and then we'll go to the questions.
Yeah. Why don't before we close, maybe we just like bring it back like 30 seconds. Let's have both our guests just leave us with like a top of mind reflection of like this AI and humanities and like what it means or what you wish for.
And if you like, you could think about it in or not in like an educational context, if you prefer. It's like, what do you wish we'd be teaching? Should we be teaching something differently? But maybe just a quick take, and maybe it's a seed for our ensuing discussion.
Sure. I don't know if I can do it in 30 seconds. But I think we should be using AI or large language models to teach both how to interact with technology through humanistic lenses. I think it gives us the ability to think through how to apply humanistic forms of knowledge to the products of technology. So in an educational context, I'd very much like to see that happen. Also on the adverse side, I think large language models and AI have taught us that a lot of what we thought about language and language instruction, the importance of style, for example, as the most difficult thing, is not necessarily true. And so I think there is a case to be made for allowing contemporary large language models and AI to reevaluate how we teach aspects of language and literature.
Yeah, so I have no doubt that artificial intelligence should be used in education, in the humanities, social sciences, everywhere. I mean, although there are legitimate reasons for concern of students not learning anything and not thinking for themselves, I mean, the idea that they should be excluded, I think, is no more viable than the idea back in the 1970s or 80s that students shouldn't use calculators. As for having a better interaction between AI and the humanities and other areas, I mean, I feel at this point that having AI so embedded down inside engineering at Stanford and at many American universities is actually counterproductive and wrong, and that there are so many good linkage points between AI and the humanities, but also AI and the arts, AI and the social sciences, that they're being made harder to achieve rather than easier to achieve by disciplinary boundaries and walls.
Great. Yes, well, thank you both. For our Zoom audience, we are going to end our vodcast here. Thank you all for joining. And then for those of you in person, we can stay a bit longer for any other questions or discussions, yes, assuming our guests can stay a bit longer. Okay.
Yeah, and thank you very much to our guests. And so I guess the next portion, we'll open up to the room, and I know we have questions already.